Hello, people, and welcome back to another episode of The Tech of Tomorrow, the podcast where we believe that the real tech of tomorrow are the humans building the future. Now, remember to follow, subscribe, hit the like button if you're on YouTube. That's the housekeeping notes. Gonna keep it short because our guest today is somebody that I found on LinkedIn again, somebody whose business caught my eye, and I really wanted to interview him. He's the CEO of Salesforge, and his name is Frank. Frank, how are you?
Hey man, hey Sebastian, how's it going? Good. Just busy times, busy Q4. Yeah, and busy launching new products and onboarding a bunch of customers. So yeah, that's what we're up to these days at the Forge.
Q4 is always the busiest, right?
Yeah, historically, I think in every SaaS business, Q4 is the busiest, mainly predominantly because people are looking at maybe acquiring new tech for next year. So a lot of conversations happen typically in Q4, and you may close, deals, especially enterprise deals in Q4. So overall, yes, it's the busiest quarter, or one of the busiest quarters of the year in SaaS, and probably the other one is Q1. Also especially in the US. So yeah.
Yeah, Q4 is one of my favorites. A lot of workshops to run, strategy sessions to facilitate. It tends to, there's a lot of movement.
Yeah. It's holiday season, right? There's just a lot of things happening, and I think my least favorite quarter is Q1, Q3, even though you can go on holiday and stuff like that. But typically, what happens is in a lot of businesses just generally slows down in Q3. So yeah.
Yeah. So tell us more about Salesforge. I like the name, by the way. So tell us more about it.
Yeah, I mean the name stems, from us kind of thinking, or me thinking back in the days. Hey, so in the SaaS ecosystem, you don't have a software known as the Forge. So I thought, it has to be called as the Forge because we're doing a lot of forging essentially, and because we are selling it typically to salespeople, it has to be known as the Salesforge. Just sounds very similar to naturally Salesforce. But that's good to be, kind of thought, when you think about Salesforce, you kind of think about also at the same time about Salesforce. What Salesforce does is essentially it allows you to blend essentially sales reps and autonomous AI agents within a single software. So that's Salesforce. So we're big believers that in a few years' time, you're not going to be running just a pure, sales team in a software. You'll be augmenting that together with AI agents, and you'll be working with them in tandem. A, to reduce headcount overall, and B, to maximize pipeline coverage. And the reason why headcount is just generally a topic in a lot of companies is because acquiring net new dollars in software is just a lot more, becoming more and more expensive. So there's a line item typically that people typically look at, which is called CAC, cost of customer acquisition. And the biggest cost in a software company typically is labor. So you really need to figure out how to do more with less. And to do that, you need to build a specific type of software, essentially, that would allow you to reduce headcount and still achieve significantly higher outputs. So there's a lot of legacy software in the space that optimizes essentially software for more headcount. And then we're part of the new gen sort of companies that typically look at headcount reduction. So there's a lot of other companies that are in a similar space or maybe they're in other spaces, but they're all looking at how to reduce headcount. And so we have got Salesforge is what we call the core product, but then we also have other sort of adjacent sort of products to Salesforge. We have a couple of products specifically on email infrastructure. So we provision email infrastructure for companies to improve deliverability and essentially not send emails from their primary domains and therefore safeguarding the reputation of the primary domain, but actually sending emails from what's called secondary domains, which are permutations of the primary. So let's say our primary domain is salesforce.ai. We then set up domains like team salesforce.ai, get salesforce.ai, and so on and so forth. And then the final solution is what's called warm forge. So essentially it's a warm-up solution. So it allows you to improve the deliverability of your domain infrastructure by mimicking real human behavior. And there's a lot of other things like checking the blacklist, checking the DNS records, and many other things that we're also looking to do in the future. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we do, and we essentially mimicking companies, if somebody knows on the audience, called Rippling or other companies, we're essentially building a lot of different pieces of software, and we're selling that to the same customer.
A lot of, a lot to unpack there. What's the main difference, would you say? There are premise. There are a bunch of lead generation agencies nowadays that
Yeah.
offer to have domains to automate your outreach. What's the main difference between Salesforge and a lead generation agency, besides the fact that in a lot of cases, a lead gen agency is run by a 16-year-old?
I mean, a lot of lead gen agencies use our tech to service the customers. So I wouldn't say that we sort of compete against lead gen agencies. It's just that let's say today you're a business owner and your goal is to generate pipeline, which is most B2B businesses out there. You have three options. You either hire people in your company to generate pipeline. You would outsource that to, say, to an agency that does it potentially better than you do, or maybe cheaper, whatever the reasons are. And then actually three, you can hire what's called autonomous agents these days. So these are the three main options in the market. And so if you're going to hire your own sales team, you would use Salesforge. If you would go through the agency route, a lot of agencies use Salesforge. And then the third route, which is autonomous agents, you also can use Salesforge for that. So it's just that you decide on sort of your strategy on how you want to execute your go-to-market. But in a lot of cases, Salesforge can be used across all those three options.
Good. Now, you mentioned staff reduction. How much of the sales process can the AI take over? That would be my first question. If you have to give
So
a percentage.
I won't say, so there's a lot of companies that say we can remove 100%. But one thing that you can't definitely remove is the human component. So human component, specifically when you actually jump on a call, a human wants to talk to another human, right? So that will, I think, always be in place. So what we call the bottom of the funnel or mid funnel, right? So you jump on a call, have a conversation with a human, buy from them. Well, what can be sort of automated in full is what we call the top of the funnel bit. So the hardest bit, which is actually generating pipeline. Right now, successfully, that's done in the outbound space via email. There are some legal constraints in the voice channel, meaning actually cold calling prospects. In the US, for example, it's illegal to use AI agents in cold calling. So I would say you can definitely automate a good chunk of reaching out to folks. And we just generally optimize long-term to reduce headcount for the pipeline building teams anywhere between 20 to 60%. That's really what we're targeting. And we're able to do that. And funny enough, our largest customers are the smallest teams out there. So it already works for them. And we're just looking for more companies that essentially are looking to scale their business, but doing so being very lean and mean. So if you want to be lean and mean, you have to kind of go out there and consider software that can help you to do that, as in reduce pressure on hiring. So there are softwares out there. So I would always say it doesn't matter what you're looking into, whether that's sales software or accounting essentially. Look at software that help you essentially to reduce headcount. So there's a lot of softwares actually out there that already focus specifically from that angle, because anything that's repetitive, accounting, sales, many other kind of jobs out there, they're sort of prone to automation, right? So the software is definitely kind of, and sophistication is there to help companies do that.
Besides the sales moment, the call, what would you say are the parts of the sales process that AI cannot take over?
So I would say social part. I think that is sort of impossible, because let's take LinkedIn as a social platform, right? So let's say you set up an agent. Well, that agent needs a social profile, right? So if you don't decide to create an agent account, let's say on LinkedIn, in the eyes of LinkedIn, that's a fake account, right? That account does not exist. It's not a real human. So if it's not a real human, that account will get flagged and it will get permanently sort of banned essentially from LinkedIn. So I don't believe that also agentic capabilities will work long term or ever. So in social platforms, and neither they will work in voice most likely because of the regulations, let's say, like in the US, right? So it's currently right now it's banned. So that means really you can only do it in email. And then yeah, it becomes, a question of, maybe, whether US in the future will also do something about it. But either way, so yeah, social voice, very tricky, but then this highly depends, on the voice part, it highly depends on geography. So you may not be able to, cold call somebody in the US, but you can cold call somebody, I don't know, in Spain, say, right? So using the AI agent. So it really depends. So there are some limitations to AI agents, but still, even with limitations in mind, the fact that an AI agent is 10x cheaper than spending on headcount on a single, individual, just purely because of that fact, you should be utilizing agents. Because these days it's not about growth at all costs, right? It's not about applying in humans and kind of to solve your pipeline problem. It's about being smart of how you're acquiring these dollars. And a lot of companies essentially acquire new business or new revenue very, very inefficiently. And there's only so much you can do to improve those efficiencies. So one of the things that you should really, really tackling is figuring out, okay, even with limitations of the agentic capabilities out there, you can still implement them in a lot of places or a lot of geographies that can significantly boost your efficiencies. I'll give you one example. So let's say you have a company of, I don't know, and you have 100 sales employees, maybe 50, doesn't matter. But you typically would assign those sales reps. So I used to run a sales team of 50 in my previous gig. So you typically assign sales reps in territories where you would see the highest return. Because it's very, as I said, it's very expensive to hire people. So you would not go after, let's say you operate enterprise, mid-market, and SMB sales motion. So you typically not put reps into the SMB sales motion. You typically assign them to mid-market and enterprise in a big company. So when it comes to AI agents, because they're 10x cheaper, you could assign them potentially to the SMB segment, right? And generate pipeline through SMBs. And if you can automate most of that segment, then you are essentially ultimately generating more pipeline than you used to. So yeah, that's just an example.
Okay. Tell me more about, for the people listening. Salesforce just launched a new product recently, at least. It's called Agent Frank. So tell me more about Agent Frank.
So yeah, that agent, or the first agent, was named after me because back in the days when I used to work for a few CEOs out there, I typically was one of the top salespeople in a company when I used to be in frontline sales. And a CEO would typically tell me, "Hey, Frank, there's no way we could replicate you." Well, now there is, so now there is a way to replicate me. And essentially, we were dumping a lot of knowledge from my good old days of being in frontline sales, even though I do sales right now as well. But essentially, dumping a lot of knowledge that I've learned into a software, right? So to essentially all the know-hows and how to do X, Y, Z's, just dump that into a software so that it can automate a good chunk of your sales outreach. So it's something we launched a few weeks ago. We're already onboarding several clients on it. It's looking pretty good. It's literally an autonomous capability. So what does that actually practically mean? So you would go into software, and you would, once you create that sort of setup of Agent Frank, first, it will ask you, who's your ICP, right? So you outline your ICP, and then the system will essentially go out there and look for your leads versus your ICP criteria. Then next, it will actually craft a unique email in any language to that particular recipient, right, that we have found. And then when one of those recipients replies back to you, with whatever that is, whether that's saying no thank you, or take me off your list, or yes I'm interested, or what's the pricing, essentially an agent essentially engages back within a few minutes. And you can actually have a full-on conversation via email. So you can think of it as a chatbot, but it's designed in a way that it's not a chatbot. It's designed in a way that it seems like a proper full-on conversation between two humans via email. So you can use your own name, you can create an avatar, whatever it is that you want to do. But that can actually drive all the way down to what's called a macro conversion event, which is typically meeting booked. Or it could be a click-out event, essentially. So meeting book, meaning it actually books meetings for you as a company. So that's what it does. So it's very powerful, right? Because if you imagine you wake up in the morning and you have suddenly one, two, three, maybe meetings booked Monday to Friday when you wake up, right, and go into the office, that's the sort of feeling, what we provide for the companies out there.
In your experience, in which industries those cold outreach work best?
I would say in the industries that are not that saturated. So what does that mean? So saturation means typically markets like US, they're super, super saturated. Then industries like e-commerce, super, super saturated. Or any sort of service-based offering like SEO services, cold email services, whatever other services, right? So if there's thousands and thousands of people reaching out about the same thing, about that particular service, then it's like super saturated. But the markets that are not saturated, I don't know, could be markets like Eastern Europe, for example, is a very interesting one. Nordics typically comes up quite frequently. Even the Southern Europe, Latin America, Asia Pacific. So that those markets are markets where you typically don't send out actually many emails. That's because the probability of a conversion is just much lower. The probability essentially of a person buying your product is also much lower, right? So this is why there's just far fewer emails per recipient that they receive in those parts of the world. Um, and yeah, Western Hemisphere, so Western Europe plus US, Canada, they receive a lot of emails these days because there's just so many companies that are targeting these territories. So this is why it's just harder to stand out from the crowd. But this is why I typically say why you need to sort of be doing a lot of multi-threading, meaning reaching out to multiple individuals, then also doing multi-channel, meaning when you send an email, it's a couple emails or 3 emails, then you touch base via say LinkedIn or phone call. Like it's super important that you do these, do these things, especially in markets where it's like super saturated.
Let's say the head of a sales team and I start using Salesforge. What is a good reply rate I can expect from the product? Do you have an average there?
No, so this is quite a tricky question to ask because reply rates highly vary depending on industry and the ICP, so the ideal customer profile, and the territory that you need, right? So as I said, the less saturated it is, the higher the reply rate you'll get. And if you use also localization, meaning you actually write an email in the native mother tongue of that recipient, the reply rates can easily double. So this is why making averages it's a tricky one. But what a good reply rate looks like, so what do you want to optimize towards, is typically about a 5% reply rate. And then from that, about 20% positive reply rate, or in total, a 1% positive reply rate is what you want to optimize towards. And then if you got the 1% positive reply rate, then half of those turn up into a demos essentially, or meetings that you're booking. So 0.5% demo sort of book rate is pretty good out there. But I can tell you, to book at least one meeting with an individual, typically we see anywhere between 200 to 1,000 people that you need to reach out to actually book one meeting. So that's the roughly the range. So if somebody sends out 100 emails today, and then you're gonna say cold email doesn't work. Well, yeah, because statistically speaking, it's highly likely that you would have booked actually a meeting. So yeah, unfortunately, due to the way the markets are right now, due to saturation, due to competition, meaning multiple people reaching out about the same service, the likelihood of conversion is just rather low. But it's the same arguably across other channels as well. So whether that's cold calling on LinkedIn, they also have their own problems as well today. So LinkedIn, for example, became very, very saturated with a bunch of automation tools. So it's, again, not as effective as it used to be, say, a couple of years ago. So people also don't respond anymore that actively due to the essentially fatigue in LinkedIn. So I'll give you an example. So let's say when I put my title as CEO and the founder of a company, I started to get more and more messages And I think now on a daily basis, I get about 5 to 10 messages from people, from different type of people selling me something. And I got maybe like one before that, one a day. Now it's like, let's say 10x, just more people messaging me on LinkedIn trying to sell some sort of service. And the same will happen with cold calling. So if you're gonna start giving out my mobile telephone number, so this is a device to everybody. Do not share your mobile telephone number with anybody. So literally, just even if there's a sign up for, just give a fake one. Because otherwise, once it goes into CRM, right, then it will go somewhere else, and ultimately, your number will start. Yeah, you'll start sharing your number with a lot of different parties, and you'll start getting a lot of cold calls. But even cold calling, is super, super saturated these days. That's because getting a person on the phone is just very tricky. There's also a lot of carriers, especially in the US, and also iPhone, that starts to mark specific telephone numbers as potentially a spam at the moment if you're calling a prospect. It literally will say potentially spam, and then the person is less likely to respond. I think Apple even silences specific phone calls from specific numbers. So that's how sophisticated the tech has become. So essentially, doing outbound across all channels is just a lot more difficult due to more softwares out there, more automation, and more of everything. So yeah, it is trickier, but this is why there's also systems that are essentially also on the outreach side, becoming smarter and smarter with every year, and standing out, from the crowd and delivering a bit of pattern interrupt in the daily life of a potential buyer is super important these days. So authenticity also plays, a huge role for the buyers these days. But yeah, that means maybe some of the things that you're doing, you may not necessarily be doing full on sort of automation across the software that you use.
So if somebody watching would like to implement Salesforge, another thing they might ask is, do you also provide access to lead lists, or should they source them from somewhere else?
We don't yet provide lead lists, but we're going to start doing so in a couple months' time or so. So our next product that we're building will provide actually data. And then we provide essentially everything to our customers. But yeah, for now, we just refer a lot of all of our customers to different data vendors out there. And there's a lot of good ones where they use a database, I don't know, like Apollo, super simple, right? So it's really good to kind of get your baseline data from them. Then there's a lot of sort of waterfall style sort of providers, whether it's Clay.com or Better Contact, or there's just a lot of them actually out there that you can use. But there's just so many choices out there. And data these days is a bit of a commodity, I'll be honest with you. So you just go to the vendor that gives you the best coverage versus your ICP, or you go to through the waterfall style of enrichment, where you go to multiple data vendors, but ultimately you get the maximum possible what's called lead coverage for the cheapest possible price. That's what you want to do. So yeah, and the expensive piece of data in the ecosystem today is actually mobile telephone number data. So there's a lot of data vendors that have mobile telephone numbers for your prospects. And that data is essentially premium data. So they'll charge like 20x. So when if one lead costs about 1 cent, let's say, roughly, then they're going to charge 20 cents from the mobile telephone number of that particular prospect. So it's like it's very, very expensive to get mobile telephone numbers these days. But naturally converts potentially much better than anything else, right? If you can call your prospect in your mobile telephone number. So that's why it's so expensive these days.
Makes sense. What has been the biggest challenge of building Salesforge?
So kind of give you, again, to recap a bit of context here. So, in the last 15, 16 months, we've shipped 4 softwares. So I can tell you that I don't know any other company in this category, maybe another category, where in the first 15 months of building a startup, we suddenly have 4 softwares. So that means the biggest challenge that we have as a business is shipping software or code like crazy. But we have a good correlation between shipping more code and making more money. So that's why we keep on doing that. So we highly focus on building a lot more software than spending money somewhere else. I don't know, like spending a crazy amount of money, let's say in marketing or sales, etc. We believe if you build a great product, or if you build multiple great products that all have a high overlap, and you're selling that to the same persona, you're actually making a huge difference in the buyers. And that kind of skyrockets your business as well. So I would say, yeah, engineering product probably is the biggest challenge. But also at the same time, if you look at the landscape, right? So gonna give you some mega trends in here. So the biggest mega trend, right, if you are in the world of email, specifically cold email, is there's a lot of data out there that tells you that there's just more and more emails being sent every single year. So that means buyers are overwhelmed by more and more emails today. And there's also a lot more sort of bad actors in the email ecosystem that typically most people would not see, sending, for example, ransomware to enterprise companies and so on and so forth. So these are huge, huge mega trends, and it's something that Gmail and Outlook see quite well because the two main email service providers that pretty much dominate the B2B landscape when it comes to providing email infrastructure to their customers. So they naturally see that. And as a response, especially with the last 2 years, was introducing a bunch more restrictions in the world of email. A lot of restrictions. So, and that has essentially negatively impacted the bad guys and also the good guys. So companies just, that just normally send cold emails, right, to their prospects. So the efficiencies have massively tanked over the years. And so we have done a lot to kind of help on that topic, but what is definitely challenging for a business is because there's every pretty much month or 2 months, every 2 months or a month, every month sort of you seeing a lot more restrictions coming in. So you kind of have to adjust your software with new restrictions that are coming into effect. But I always say, so while, let's say Gmail Outlook introducing new restrictions, and then we are introducing a bunch of new features, this is essentially the friction between these sort of two sides, right? So one side is sending emails, the other side is receiving emails, right? So and they're trying to, Google is trying to increase their filters. We're trying to figure out how to go around those filters in a way, or rather, help those legit sellers, still deliver the emails as they used to. So that friction is essentially what essentially a lot of companies are capitalizing on, right? Because if emails don't get delivered anymore these days in the primary mailbox of the recipient, then I can tell you a lot of businesses actually would die out there because a lot of companies are heavily relying on email as a channel of staying alive. So if email as a channel does not work anymore, then they will die eventually. So yeah, I know a lot of companies that pretty much 90% of the revenue comes from email. So that would just die if Gmail and Outlook somehow kills that channel for them, right? So that's why it's email for a lot of companies is a lifeline. It's very tricky to be always on top of it, but I believe by us being sort of nimble and sort of adjusting to all the changes that are sort of being thrown at us and our customers consistently is what drives sort of customer satisfaction essentially. So yeah.
So would you say that your biggest competitive advantage or your differentiation point as a company is product, the focus on just making it better and better?
Yes, and the reason why it has to be product rather than anything else is because when you look at the landscape, so the landscape is, right, so let's say Salesforge, there's a bunch of other kind of tools in the market. So somebody else may have maybe better go-to-market strategy or better something, but typically what happens is whoever has the best product in the market is the one that gets the most attention, at least in our space. So this is why building a kick-ass product is super, super important. And I'm not saying we're perfect at it, but we're definitely doing a good job in most companies out there in our space. Yeah, so you have to kind of decide, depending on the category and etc., what should be kind of your main strength, right? What do you want to be known for? And in our case, that's product engineering. So that means when we spend money on something, we would rather spend more money on hiring more engineers and product people than hiring more salespeople or marketing people. So that's how we kind of think about stuff. Because that money is directly improves the deliverability, say, of our customers or improves the pipeline results. Whereas spending a bit more money on sales and marketing doesn't necessarily improve the results of existing customers. It just drives new customers into the product, right? So, but yeah, there's always naturally a fine balance there. But yeah, some companies are heavily, marketing and sales led, while others will be more sort of engineering product, will be more of an engineering and product kind of like company. So yeah.
Well, if I remember the data correctly, acquiring a new customer is at least 3 or 7 times, I don't know, more expensive than just getting more value, delivering more value to a current one. So yes, I do understand that lifetime value is a big piece of this.
Yeah. I mean, also, having a high churn rate is not really great for the business, right? So just generally speaking. And even though the market is humongous out there, if you think of it also from a different aspect. So in our category, a huge channel for customer acquisition is actually word of mouth. So that means if you actually listen to your existing customers and if you build stuff for them, they're gonna go and refer a lot more customers out there to your platform. So you definitely want to satisfy the needs primarily for the existing customers, and only then look at building stuff for net new customers, especially if you have very strong word of mouth, which is the case for us. So yeah, we want our customers to shout from the rooftops, so saying, hey, Salesforge is the best product out there, and that just brings in new customers. And it's something not maybe many companies really think about from kind of word of mouth perspective, but you definitely want that to happen because word of mouth is one of the cheapest essentially channels of customer acquisition, right? So when we are also thinking about how do we acquire our users, I already told you we don't spend that much money on acquiring customers actually. So our cost of customer acquisition is actually very low. One of the reasons is kind of that we have very strong word of mouth in place. So yeah.
Where do you see the company in 5 years?
5 years. So in 5 years, instead of having 4 softwares, we're going to have probably at least 10 softwares. And it is going to become what we call a bit of an ecosystem. So what we're going up against essentially is a bunch of point solutions that are in the space. And we're building an ecosystem of softwares, like a suite of apps, essentially, where the overarching stack will be a lot cheaper, will perform better, and your sort of sales ops even overhead will be much smaller. But really, in 5 years' time, apart from that, we want customers to come to us, not because we have a lot of software, but because actually we'll give them what we call the smartest way or the most converting way, essentially, to acquire pipeline. So we're building a lot of data capabilities behind the scenes, whether you're going to use that for your sales team or whether you're going to use that for AI agents. But essentially, these data capabilities will unlock essentially smart acquisition. So thinking things about when to send an email, what should go into the email, etc. So it's using what we call big data behind the scenes to power the acquisition of our customers. So it's similar to what essentially Google and Facebook does right now there. So they also use a lot of big data to run the ad auctions for the advertisers. So we're going to use something like that rather than relying on essentially humans to make decisions when it comes to acquiring new customers. So yeah, we're kind of seeing that huge transformation right now happening in the space. So yeah, it's going to be quite exciting, I would say, for the next 5 years for sure.
What's the biggest challenge you see in building that ecosystem?
So kind of, already said, kind of build shipping a lot of code and good code consistently is a challenge in itself. Because it's a bit like rowing, right? So you need to keep up with the pace, and the whole team has to be rowing together, right? For a few years before you can, step off the gas for a bit. So kind of getting into the motion of aggressively shipping, that's very difficult because they're essentially mimicking top 1% of the world's best companies out there. One of the reasons why some of them became so sort of successful is because they were shipping very, very well and consistently. And yeah, it's just challenging itself, especially with what's happening in the space, as I said, with new restrictions and many other things that are coming, into play. You kind of have to kind of future-proof also your ecosystem, right? You're going to have to predict some of the things that may happen, let's say in a few years' time in the industry, also in email, etc. So it's a bit being, having a crystal ball and trying to see what will happen in 5 years' time with Google and Outlook and whatever else is there, right? So, and trying to see where the other players are headed in this industry and how they will impact your business. Because a lot of things in our ecosystem is very much interlinked. So if something happens somewhere else, it impacts us either for better or worse, right? So yeah, so this is the trickiest part of the business. Whereas in other software categories that I was in, other parties had no impact on us. So essentially, your success really depends on you. In our case, a lot of our success depends on other parties and what they're going to decide to do. So yeah, that's the challenge in itself. And then yeah, when you're building a lot of software, as I said, that you kind of have to future-proof. You kind of have to think, and because otherwise you'll end up building something that you may need to refactor essentially. So change the whole software in a different way, right? So there'll be a lot of ways to resource in that sense. Yeah, so I think that's the biggest challenge, sort of, as a CEO. It's just like trying to predict the future, really. So yeah.
How you mentioned that everybody has to roll together to deliver the software continuously. How big is your focus on culture and quality recruitment?
It's very big. So as part of our hiring process, we typically have a let's call it a culture step. We don't look at it from what we call culture fit perspective. We look at it from what we call culture add perspective. How can we add new individuals to the culture that think, very differently about, business. Maybe they came from a different industry, as an example. Maybe they've done something differently, or maybe they think about the world in a particular way. Doesn't really matter. But adding individuals with a new perspective on how to run a business is very important. Essentially, this is what Google does, what Facebook does, right? So a bunch of other companies as well. So culture is a huge thing for us. And yeah, we have a final step in our interview process is what we call culture step, trying to figure out whether the person is a fit with the team. So kind of on the hiring process, we typically have like 3 or 4 steps. So the first step is like really understanding whether there's something in here with the individual when you speak to them. Step 2 is like we just test competence, and step 3 is we test culture. I call it test culture, but it's really trying to figure out, even though the person is very competent, maybe they're not going to be a really good fit. And yes, we have to reject candidates due to culture. We have to fire people due to culture. So we treat culture very seriously because you want to be in a company where you don't have what we describe culture problems, right? You want to be in a company where you don't have any of those issues, and typically that will have a significant impact on retention of employees, right? So you want to keep good people in the company for as long as you can, right? But to do that, you need to create an environment where you don't have, well, first and foremost, any politics, arguably, or any sort of culture issues in place. But you really are all aligned towards the same goal, serving your customers as well as you can. What we typically say, no bullshit culture. But the way also that we look at culture as well, maybe to look at it from a kind of being a CEO of your own turf, right? That a lot of people say. So we do a lot of what we call bottoms up style of leadership. So we typically say to a lot of other people that we're looking for what we call autonomous humans. So you come into the business. Let's say I was just hiring for a marketing partnerships manager for the company. and we never hired a person like this. So really the goal is that you come in, you roll up your sleeves, you already have some experience in the field, but you will lead this particular field. You will come up with a plan, not I will come up with a plan. Right? So a lot of people ask me, Frank, what have you done so far? Or what would you like me to do? Or where this should be headed, this sort of thing. And it's like, I don't know, like you tell me. Right. So, and then I'm just here, more of a buddy, let's call it that way, to kind of validate the plan more so than leading that plan, right? So I'm telling you what to do. So I think in a lot of companies, there's somebody high up that tells you what you need to do, and I think a lot of people, especially in Europe, are used to that. But typically, most successful companies are the ones where you see a lot of individuals in the company driving their own, remit of the business individually. Right. And overall, that leads to huge success within the company. But finding those people is like super, super difficult. But you can. So yeah, it's definitely part of culture, how people also think about sort of driving impact for the business. Like if you really want to drive impact, you don't do what your manager tells you. You actually come up with a plan, you execute that plan really well, and you take the credit for the work. Right. And then that's really what the describe best in class employees for the startup world, right? So if you're unable to do that, so meaning you need to take instructions from somebody else on what needs to be done, you're better off to work in a corporate. So in some of the cases, we will tell the person, listen, you're not a startup person. You sound like you want to be in a corporate environment. We will just be very transparent in the interview. Right, so there's what we call a culture clash a bit. So yeah, and you need to know in your own head whether you're more of a startup-y person or you're more of a corporate environment person. Like, and arguably in the early days, so let's say when you're in your early 20s, you probably want to be more in a corporate environment. So you get what I call get a bit of discipline, because discipline is important. There's also a lot of folks out there that are these days what we would typically say is snowflake. Meaning they shy away from, work ethic essentially. And yeah, it's just how I think the world has evolved over time. So hard work is not as as a thing as it used to be maybe 10 years ago. There's essentially a lot more essentially what we just say snowflake. So people have very high expectations from the employer, but then they don't actually do much. So we also see that sort of dilemma, cultural sort of dilemma, with a lot of people that are out there right now in the job market. So yeah.
I like that answer. Checks out with what I've seen consulting companies. Best cultures I've come across, they have these people that are not micromanaged, they are not given plans, and they just get hired because they are an expert and they are able to deliver on their expertise, which I think is how it should work.
Yeah, but even if you're not an expert, like you will figure it out essentially, right? So I will not need to figure it out for you, most of the time, right? So the people that can figure it out themselves out, the problem that they need to solve, those are the people that you're looking for. You can call them problem solvers, right? So, but yeah, there's no mommy, daddy there, big manager, that will tell you what needs to be done and where you need to be headed. You need to use your own brain and figure stuff out. And a lot of people just have a hard time with it, so because otherwise, what happens is if they fail, right, they don't want to look bad. But if you go to countries like US, you only can become successful through a ton of failure. So you have to embrace failure to a degree where you're optimizing towards success. That's why a lot of startup founders fail a lot of times before they actually become successful for once. So, and you have to be in that mindset. I will risk, and I'll do X, Y, Z. I will test it. I will make a bet, whatever. And it's a calculated bet, right, or risk that you're making. But people have to be, in the mindset of doing that, because otherwise the CEO makes all the bets and all the risks. And arguably the person that's closest to that area of work, whether that's marketing, partners, sales, etc., they're actually arguably the best equipped potentially to do those bets. in the term, right? So rather than the CEO who is maybe more distant from that particular area of the business and doing that bet for them, right? So
And
yeah,
has to be also, there has to be the concept of failure has to be part of the culture as something that's allowed. Because if you fear experimenting, which is something I've come across too, people in certain cultures fear putting themselves on the line because then they know that their middle manager or anyone who's above them will basically punish them for failing. When instead failure is part of the job of any job.
yeah. I mean, unless you're a doctor, then
No,
that's like right?
you don't want the surgeon to
Just
fail.
an asterisk there, So yeah, there are some jobs where failing is not an option. But yeah, in most of the cases, right, when there's no what we call, I mean, there are some financial repercussions, right? But if nobody dies, then it's all good, right? So when you fail, especially mistakes or failures, yes, they're expensive, but um, there's also a thing called what's called a cost of inaction. So cost of not experimenting. So, the reason, for example, why Google became such a big company is because they run, I don't know, thousands and thousands and thousands of experiments simultaneously. They're trying to figure out, right? And most of them fail, 90+%. And you have to be in the mindset of, like, I will do XYZ test every quarter, every week, whatever, right? And I will try and figure out what will make this business fly, what will improve conversion rate, what will double it, triple it, whatever, right? So yes, you have to be in the mindset of kind of figuring out what can improve significantly this business. But unless you're in a mindset of experimenting, testing, trying to essentially become, building a better version of the business and also say better version of yourself, right? Pushing the business forward, pushing yourself forward, right? To experiment. Unless you're in that mindset, things will just not happen at all. So yeah, and it's not something that you can, unfortunately, when a person applies for a job here at Salesforge or somewhere else, not something that you can sort of teach that, within a week. It's very hard. So this is why it's something that we look as part of the culture, as well. And there was a lady that I interviewed today this morning. She literally said that. So I will, go out there or experiment or test XYZ things. And that's exactly what you want to hear. People showing that what I would also say hunger for success. So this is what I typically say in an interview. We're looking for people that exhibit hunger for success, for professional development, and if you're in sales, for money, right? If you're not driven by money and you're in sales, and I don't hear that from you, I'm not sure the sales is the right job for you. Maybe it's another job. Maybe you should be, I don't know, somewhere in another maybe adjacent category where you also speak to people, I don't know, like customer success, for example, so account management or something else, right? So, but there have to be these sort of drivers that you exhibit in individuals when you speak to them for the first time. And when you're having a 30-minute conversation, if you don't sense that hunger in the individual, unlikely that they will be a good fit for the company, I must say. Of course, there's a bunch of introverts out there, but you still need to be able to, as a hiring manager, be able to exhibit, see those traits in the individual.
Since we're talking about sales and hiring, and you were a top salesperson, so somebody watching this and looking at Salesforge, if they belong to a sales team or the lead one, they will probably inevitably wonder what makes a top salesperson and how do they avoid being among the ones that get reduced with the rest of the staff?
You mean like layoffs?
Yes.
So nobody will ever put a person through layoffs if they have been what's called an active employee, like really active. So let's say if you're top salesperson in the company, highly likely you will ever be laid off. Highly likely. And that's an example I can give you from one of my jobs. So we used to be a company of 100, like 20 employees or something. And we got decimated down to 20 employees. And I was the only sales rep that was left in the company. Because when you're number one, or you're like whatever, you're in the top, it will be very strange if somebody lets you go. because that would be a very stupid mistake. Every company needs sales, but you're only keeping what we call, let's call it the big guns or whatever you want to call them. There's a lot of saying to those people, but essentially the A players. Like, it's a very stupid mistake to be letting them go, even during the layoffs. So probably the best way to answer this, you need to be in the leaderboard. That's all.
What made you the top salesperson at that company and in other companies? What do you think makes what does it take to become a top salesperson in any company?
It's what I just said, I believe, a while ago, which is you need to exhibit that hunger. Like, in a leaderboard, that means you're building the biggest pipeline, you have the most deals, and you're closing at a frequency that nobody else can keep up with you. And to do that, you need to have this discipline. You need to have you need to be working like a horse, essentially. Where week in, week out, you build pipeline. You have X activity levels, which is probably, in my case, I would suspect I had 2 to 3x high activity levels than the closest sales rep. So if you're building pipeline at such such a high rate, then you do overtake most of the other guys. Yeah, at one point, I had more pipeline than out of 5 salespeople. More pipeline meaning I had actually half of companies' pipeline was under my name, and then the other half was, with other 5 people. So when you have so much pipeline and so many deals coming through, you're definitely visible. And it's not just a one-off. It's consistently that you have such a what's called fat pipeline in a company. But to build that fat pipeline, you need to also know how to build top of the funnel, which is the hardest part, like how to build that pipeline. It's very difficult. Yeah, but you need to be very consistent, very disciplined. You need to put in your activity levels, and it's hard to maybe sum up what you need to do. And every other top salesperson will tell you something different. Because the way that they get to results is maybe different the way I get to results. But you definitely want to be what's called customer obsessed, right? To understand really whether you're solving the problem or not. And if you are, you should be doubling down on your messaging. You should be meeting up with them. You should be speaking to other stakeholders in the company. You should be meeting them at all possible events that you're going to, right? So I typically say if you're going to a trade show or event, and if you have less than 10 meetings a day, you're not doing a good job. You might say 10 meetings is a standard. And if you don't have 10 meetings in the calendar, that's where essentially pipeline problems start to evolve. Like, you need to be figuring out how to build pipeline. So let's say when you go to a trade show, you're definitely messaging all people, for example, that are attending trade shows. So these are just some sort of few tidbits. But it's very hard to kind of put that into a few sentences. What is it that you need to do? This is why I typically would just summarize that you need to exhibit that hunger. So if you're typically hungry and you're in sales, you'll do all sorts of things. You'll call people, you'll message them, you'll message their friends, you message their bosses, you'll message their direct employee, direct report, people that are reporting to them, and many other things. And as long as you have a product that is what's called a solid product and it solves a big pain, they will end up talking to you. And yes, many of them will say no to you, but a lot of them will also say yes to you, right? So, yeah.
Like that answer. Listen, as we close, I have 2 last questions for you. The first one is, do you have any controversial opinions you're comfortable sharing with the audience? Can be about the industry, can be about anything. Can be about snowflakes.
Controversial opinions. So yeah, maybe which is controversial. So I'm typically would say I'm a big believer in what's called hiring fast and firing fast motion. Very similar to how sales teams just run. So we do something similar here at Salesforge. So like, you should be hiring people when you feel 80% confident about an individual being a very strong fit for the company. because you can't get to perfection. Like there's no way. You really need to put people through, the typical probation period, whether that's 3 months or some countries it's like 6 months. But anyway, you need to put people through a probation period for at least 3 months and treat that as a trial, right? To see, like literally to the trial. Like that's what probation period is meant to be. And if it doesn't pan out, you let them go. Like it's simple as that, right? And I can tell you most companies don't operate that way. So when they hire the individual, pretty much most of them pass the probation period, and that's it. They stay in the company for a long time. Even though those people are not really active for the company, they're not really a fit. But and I think the problem here is that a lot of folks struggle, about thinking through kind of about rehiring, right? Finding another person for the role. So, and yeah, well, other people in the industry will say, no, I mean, you want to, train an employee or et cetera. But if within 3 months you didn't feel like, there's a strong fit for whatever, there's, has to be kind of, good reason for that, right? So then you should be parting ways as soon as possible, because actually that's more damaging for your business and for the rest of the team. That's more damaging than not having it. And also, the other probably thing I would say is like, even if you're kind of pressured to hire a specific individual. So in our case, we're hiring for what we call a growth manager or head of growth for the company. And we still didn't hire that person since April this year. So it's been a very long time since we didn't find what we call the right growth manager. But what I can say is like, it is sometimes, when you don't get through the interview stage, it's like a very, what we call excitement about an individual. If you didn't get excitement, if you didn't get conviction in that individual making a huge impact for your business, do not hire them. And arguably for us, head of growth role is the closest role to the co-founding team. That's how we look at that, because head of growth essentially drives the growth of the business. All right, so it's like a super critical role in the company, and you're responsible, we call for the output metric in our case, like the MQLs. So yeah, and you have to get really excited about every person that you hire into the role. And if you don't get excitement, just pass. Because hiring them and, without the excitement, if you hire them, then it's actually worse than going through this sort of, hire fast, and fire fast motion. You should hire fast only when you get excited about individuals. So yeah.
I like that. Final question is, if people want to find out more about you, about Salesforge and Agent Frank, where can they find all that information?
The typical places. LinkedIn, just search for Frank Sondors. There's one guy with a bacon emoji. That's me. And then you can just pop into our site, salesforge.ai. There's also a chat bubble there. You can speak to me directly in the chat. So yeah, pretty easy. So
it's great. Frank, thank you so much for taking the time being on the show.
No worries. And if there's anything I can do, guys, let me know. Cheerio.
People, reach out if you need them. This was the Tech of Tomorrow with Sebastian Hidalgo and Frank Sondors. See you in the next episode.